This is Justice Warriors, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 16. My name's Andy and I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
I almost mixed up the order then.
No, you can't do that.
I just thought that would just put everyone off.
Was the video panel wrong this week?
So this episode is about resurrection. So we've been talking, last episode we talked about heaven. We spent a lot of time talking about how the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God exists now and we're part of it now. But as part of this series about what we might be calling, say, the future, we want to talk about resurrection, and then we'll have another episode about does everyone get in and stuff like that. So we'll try and avoid talking about that kind of thing. This time we'll talk about resurrection, which probably involve quite a bit of talking about death, but we'll and new life and stuff like that. We'll see. So shall we start with our homework? It's the usual type of sad story about our homework. So Jörg, why don't you tell us what our homework was?
So the homework was to read Mark Twain's Captain Stormfield Goes to Heaven, because Mark Twain sort of plays with the idea what heaven would look like if not just the earth would go in for eternity, basically, or for however long it takes, but all planets in the universe. So that makes for some very, very interesting reading. Different cultures in heaven, very open space, quite cynical at times, but also interesting because he really does wrestle with the idea of how do you exist after you get there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So
that was the task, to read it, yeah.
Yeah, so Leah and I have failed to do our homework, and you'd already done it, presumably, so...
Well, I did it again, actually. I was
again.
totally teacher's pet. I did it again.
In order to shame us.
Man.
Yeah. No, I'm going all in this.
I feel really bad now. I thought you just had an easy ride of it because you'd read it already, but you actually read it again.
When I sent you that link, I downloaded it again, I read it again, counting on all of us reading it, of course.
Yeah. Thinking, it'll be really good when Andy and Leah read this.
Yeah. I thought we could just base our whole discussion on it. And,
So can you just summarise that
this
for
week's
us,
episode?
Can you just summarise what you took
again.
from it and why you suggested we read it?
I just think it makes some of the sort of ridiculous ideas about heaven disappear. The sense of that we can think it as any kind of extension of life on Earth. I think that's what I like about it. It's a bit silly at times. And people aren't really all that different. They're still looking out for themselves. So it's a weird idea of heaven. He just really plays with the notion of scale, as it were.
Mm-hmm. So it's more talking about resurrection without so much of an idea of heaven. Is that fair?
No, there's Jesus there.
Okay.
There are all great people there. They don't always have, I think one of the Old Testament prophets is now a book salesman, or like they have different jobs. Like the hierarchy gets messed up a bit. There are angels that are huge, so there's a lot of that in there, but he just messes up a bit. But the thing I really like about it, again, is that he just, once you really think it through, like one of the things, for example, that he says is that heaven is completely empty. It's this vast space because it has to accompany so many more people in the future will get there. But basically you never meet anybody because, it's not full yet. It's going to take thousands, millions of years for that space to be filled with people. Or how do you, you never get to meet Abram because, he doesn't want to get crowded like so many people. Like if Abram has been in one place, then people build a monument on a footprint that gets left. Like only certain people get to see him. So there's clear hierarchies in heaven as well, because otherwise he couldn't handle the mass. So
he's like a celebrity.
Of course that's theologically not interesting. It's a little bit blasphemous because he doesn't want to take seriously this other worldly nature of heaven. And the reason why he doesn't do that is that it's actually an answer to a popular 19th century book that makes heaven appear so real in life. You know, like kind of, you go to this grassy place. I forgot the name of it. There's a really popular sort of schmaltzy kind of book about heaven that was popular after the Civil War, of telling people what it's like and how people are really just the same and they're healed now in heaven, they're good.
Right.
And it was a very human idea of heaven. Twain scales it up and makes fun of it.
Right.
Which is interesting, because one of the things I found strange about having been brought up in church for my whole life is how little I've ever heard anyone really in the church talk about what heaven is like.
Yeah.
And maybe from what you're saying, perhaps we just do such a bad job of it. It might be just as well we haven't bothered. But it is very vague. It's sort of this weird kind of cloud-based. We just have all the nonsense with harps and clouds and.
Well, that's the first thing that happens in Mark Twain's novel. They get there and they get this because that's what you have to get when you get to heaven. And after 10 minutes, they all get bored with it and they're like, "Oh, I don't enjoy this. I really don't like it. I want to sit here and sing." So the moment you go to that cloud bank where you're going to play your harp, droves of people are coming your way just saying, "Can you hold this for me?" and giving you their wings and giving you their harp. So because they're already leaving this place. So it is worth a read.
Because as a kid, you think, well, all these grown-ups seem to like being in church so much and these services seem to go on forever. Just feels like heaven's going to be one massive, great big long church service, which is just scary.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. Like, so the beginning of our discussion will be about our worries, and I think that's really interesting what you say there about how little people talk about it, because I think the other part of it, and the part that could potentially link with justice, is that people also make a lot of decisions based on this like very firm belief that this is definitely going to happen, and yet, so it's really, really important, and yet it's not necessarily very well defined, or if it is well defined, it kind of doesn't make sense because it turns into something like what Mark Twain's describing.
Maybe that's it, because it's such a fantastical idea that the minute you try and pin it down and define it, you totally diminish it. So people have given up doing that.
But how do we then make decisions based so strongly on it?
It's more of an idea or a very vague idea or concept. But the minute you start to flesh it out, then you ruin it.
So, any worries?
My worry is how do you have a place in the future which is wonderful and amazing and still includes me? Because the minute you include me and other people like me, it very quickly will become as much of a nightmare as the world is at the moment. So there you go.
Well, not to you, but yeah, I can see what you mean. Like that sense of how do you keep, maybe phrase it differently, how do you keep a sense of human identity if you can no longer rebel or disagree? Like, you can't, there's not the option of rebelling against God as far as we know in the biblical imagery of heaven. It's all supposed to be perfect. But part of what makes us us and makes us real and breathing is that we do have these imperfections. Like, we just can't imagine what our existence would be without that.
Yeah, in what sense is it me, this person, who ends up there?
Yeah. That's a good worry.
That links with I think it's almost the same worry put in more fancy language. I was listening to Peter Rollins on the Nomad podcast, and one of the things he talked about was what he called original lack. And he was kind of reinterpreting original sin to say that this kind of lack, or this kind of sense of something missing, he was kind of reinterpreting that as something as fundamental to what we are and who we are, as opposed to something that we kind of can get rid of. We often talk about like Jesus filling the hole in your life, and he was kind of saying, that hole is you in a way. And so it's the same thing then. Like, if that is us, which makes a lot of sense to me, or part of us, then is heaven a place without that? And then what? That's not me who's there then. maybe.
Yeah. Because I mean, that's he draws on Lacan, and the whole idea of desire comes out of that lack. So when you're in heaven, are you like this sort of non-desirous prop that worships God because you're now absorbed by this totality that's who you are? Like how can we imagine this identity? That's interesting. I'm afraid my worry was much more prosaic. I'm just thinking like we just have no decent language to even talk about heaven, and maybe that's one of the reasons why we don't do it. This whole idea of like city of God, I mean that comes out of a time when a city was a really cool thing, right? Because you could actually, if you ran out of eggs, you could leave your house and buy it. And they had running water, imagine. Like they had clocks made out of buckets that would fill up, so you could say, I meet you at 3 bucket full. You know, like it was an amazing social life. I only felt like that once when I was doing fieldwork in Ethiopia, and I was like in the rural part for a few weeks, and I came back in the city and I felt myself staring at buses. Like it's that kind of a like we don't have that sense anymore. So beyond that, we know so much more about biology. I think we talked about this before. So this idea that a soul somehow leaves your body, and how we now know how much of our brain actually produces that soul, that image. Like it's much harder for us to think of this disattachable element of human existence from all that we know about the brain. It's much different for us to think about the nature of time and eternity, what we know about black holes. So there's the science language out there and different cultural references that we're still drawing on the old images of the world and of what good is to make the point about heaven, and we haven't figured out to translate it.
Because that whole thing about sitting about on clouds comes from a people who knew no leisure time, for whom idleness was the gift of the rich. So there would have been a longing to be able to relax and lounge about, whereas we're, especially in these COVID lockdown times, we're only too well aware of how boring that can be. But from the times that this imagery took hold, to be able to just do your own thing and take your own time was an unimaginable luxury, wasn't it?
I'm still pretty keen on lounging around.
Yeah.
No.
Not the heart bit.
Overrated.
So, Jörg, your description of what a city, like how a city is this desirable thing, was interesting because it kind of reminds me of like the internet or smartphones. Like in a way, what's cool about cities in that imagery is access to technology or access to security as well, safety with city walls,
comfort.
And the kind of excitement that people have about their phone when they've got this new app that does this amazing thing. Maybe heaven is like having a really good app.
Yeah. Well, that. Oh God. Yeah. By the way, I found this amazing new app. No, just kidding. But that's another thing. Like the way we think about technology, and I mean, Leah's going to correct us again, but like Matrix, that whole idea of like being disembodied, or like reality being the information, not the real. That too lives so much in our culture, and we just don't have anything to draw on. And I suspect that we actually have to reconstruct the theology of heaven. That's my poor attempt at a segue. In order to be able to find new images to fill that in, because you get all these short-change things. Like it's so easy to say, oh yeah, black holes have kind of an eternity. The closer you get to it, and therefore we know eternity is possible. But that's just a shortcut. We have to unpack what the theology of heaven means in order to then think, what images do we want to use for that are more conformant to what we understand about science?
So I think we should also talk about a bit more about justice and how this links, because I think we've covered this in other episodes, but like when I talked about people making decisions on the basis of this, I feel like why it's important for us to even do this episode is because of some of the behaviour that can come out of like a naive understanding of this. For example, the idea that we just kind of evaporate into bodiless souls, and therefore, like this whole world can just be rejected. And are there other things around that like, how does this link with justice?
It's that focus on bringing the kingdom now and not just thinking of the kingdom as something that comes when we get to heaven. So the continuity of now and the future is really, really important. If we don't care about justice now and we're not working towards justice now, how do we expect to find that in heaven? We're not going to I don't believe we're going to suddenly change and suddenly have a whole pile of different passions and desires once we get to heaven.
Yeah. And I think the other bit where it links with, for me, is that the Bible connects the resurrection of Jesus so much more immediate to our life now, and we have kind of begun to just take the resurrection of Jesus as this certainty that there's something else that happens after death. And I mean, this links to what we were talking about last time. I mentioned this to you before, that I found another verse. Like, remember last time we were talking about how there's such a fork in the road, I think is how Leah put it, of how you read heaven and earth passages. If you're thinking about is it about God's presence now? If you're living in the spatial place where heaven is sort of a symbol of God's presence, or on earth, or if you're thinking about sort of this temporal, it's something that happens at the end of time. And here's another passage that we often read as a passage for being with Jesus when we die. So, and this is in Romans 6, verse 5. If we have been united with him like this in his death, we will certainly also be united with him in his resurrection. Great, right? You said the prayer, you accept Jesus' death, you'll be resurrected. But then it goes on. For we know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been freed from sin. If you're bringing this back into the idea of the kingdom of God present now, this is talking about Jesus' resurrection pointing us to a different kind of life. There's a different kind of reality of freedom from sin that can take hold if we really embrace this individual resurrection idea in the proper way. So it's not just about waiting and getting to some place, but it can really fall into now.
You justify those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. You justify those that died, they're the chosen ones.
So Jörg, you've been talking about continuity and discontinuity recently, and I feel like we really need to unpack that thing, because sometimes I feel like the kind of naive ideas of heaven are all about, it's just a discontinuity. You just get copied into a computer, and everything is
continuity. Then
no, I mean discontinuity as in everything's totally different. Like so the thing Leah was saying about how stuff that you've done in this life is relevant to heaven wouldn't be true, because we all just get copied into this perfect version of ourselves, and it doesn't matter, the past doesn't matter. But I agree that that's also a type of continuity, because it's just like, I'll just reset, like death never happened.
Yeah, I mean, I just started thinking about why we even have this notion of resurrection. Like, where does this come from and what is embodied in it? And if you just look at, so we don't know we have to be honest, we don't know anything about what happens after death. Like, we just don't know. But if you look at death itself, we know what happens. There is both continuity and discontinuity. That person is no longer able to function, no longer able to talk. All the memories that this person carries, all the characteristics, the ability to respond is all gone. But the body's still there. And it will get reabsorbed into the earth and build something new. The imprint this person has left in perhaps children or other people around themselves, The fact that they existed, the fact of their past is still there. It's not erasable. It doesn't disappear. The moment the person goes, you don't forget about it.
Yeah.
About the person. So death itself already carries that hallmark of continuity and discontinuity. And if you link that with the story of the resurrection of Jesus, you have exactly the same thing. He has this funky body where he can come through a wall, appear like a ghost out of nowhere, or you don't recognize him, as in the story of the disciples the followers of Jesus who go to Emmaus. And the minute he does this, he says, "Here, touch my body, feel my wounds." Or he appears out of thin air while the disciples are fishing. They think they're seeing a ghost. They think this is just an apparition. This is just an idea. And then he says, "Hey, can I have one of those fish?" And he eats it. So
it's very deliberate.
That's totally typical of the resurrection. There's the same continuity idea. It's still the human body that eats, that has wounds, and yet it lives in a completely different form. So I was just very attracted to this sort of correspondence between continuity and discontinuity that we see in both the experience of death and in what we hear about Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, so some other things Jesus did seem really deliberate, like talking about himself as the Son of Man, as in, the human, as well as that being obviously referring back to prophecy about the Messiah. But yeah, the thing where he eats fish, that just seems so obviously deliberate. And touching the wings and things. Like we should pay attention to when Jesus is trying to tell us things.
Yeah, and the Bible doesn't make us like what are we picturing? There's this ghost that ingests a fish and it's just all a game, but that's not what that means. It means it's that same bodily reality in a strange form. And that doesn't stop. Then Jesus goes, ascends into heaven after 40 days, but then he still keeps appearing, like to Paul.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this strange break and continuity that happens. And maybe we need to begin thinking about heaven more of that. Because what I'm afraid of is that we think of heaven more of a continuity, in the sense that we don't want to really change. What we want is, we get copied in the computer of the sky. I get that aspect of the discontinuity. But actually we feel like it's still going to be the same emotional me. I'm going to get there. I'm going to find out how others suddenly agree with what I feel or what I am. But we don't ever imagine going to heaven and finding out how completely wrong we were about everything.
Oh, we might.
Don't you?
Go on then.
I do.
Yeah, I do.
You do?
Yeah, I do. But it's still the same me doing the realising.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's still that identity, right? But this.
I think I more struggle with what we were talking about before, with the idea that I'll be a conformist once I get to heaven, because there'll be nothing to rebel against or to disagree with, which is a very fundamental part of how I conceive myself. So
that's a big discontinuity for you then.
But that would be weird, right? Because that would imply that there's nothing good about your non-conformity, right? If it's all been stripped away. Which is not right?
No, but what's the point of non-conformity if you live in eternity? Like, there's nothing to change.
Yeah, there's nothing to make happen, and that's what's so difficult to conceive of, because we are clearly as humans wired, and some of us more than others, with a sense of doing meaningful work that creates and improves and grows things. And so how do you do that in a perfect world? Which is what we think of as heaven, because everything's already great, right? So how are you going to improve it? How's it going to grow? How's it going to change? But as we were saying before, that's always a problem we have with deity. I think how does it grow? How does it change when it's perfect already? So I don't have any answer to that. What I wanted to pick up on was what you were saying. You've got to go through death, right, to get to this. That if you're going to go to heaven, or we are going to experience heaven, or it's going to come down and meet us, however that works. There's got to be a letting go.
Yeah. And here's I want to drive that even further, and just thinking about this out loud. So, this sense of discontinuity that we have, maybe, whether it's because of this eternity problem that we don't really develop, or whether it's because we find out how wrong we were, or whatever, we have to reckon with the fact that we will die, that we will be dead, that there's a radical cut between this existence now and whatever comes after. And that's the thing we would like to gloss over with the story of heaven. And we imagine the people just to be just a slimmer, healthier looking version of themselves. Perhaps that's another lovely thing in Mark Twain, that people experiment what age suits them best. Like, what is your heavenly age? That's a good question. Who are you when you're there? And you realize, no, there is no going back. It's not going to be like this. There's a radical discontinuity. So there is a fundamental, brutal reality of death, whether or not you believe in heaven. And that is so important to let ourselves fall into this, because it makes all the difference in the today and how we live. Because otherwise you kind of think, well, I didn't get to finish this now, but in heaven, that little thing will be perfect. I get to finish it there. I didn't get to experience this, but in heaven I get to experience. No, it's not like this. The death is real. There is a radical break that happens, because heaven is an alternate. It's a different kind of reality from all that we can conceive of.
And that's humbling, right? Yeah,
absolutely. It's humbling, and it brings back the terror of death to some extent.
But I think it's really helpful to me, because one of the things about the kind of you get copied into the computer in the sky thing, for me, that I find really disturbing is it just seems, I want to say, unrealistic, right? It doesn't chime with our experience of the world. So something that reading Richard Rohr has been teaching me is that he grounds his ideas, some of which are quite wacky, in our experience now, and says, this feels right because it's like what we see in life now, and that the sense that death is real is a very strong experience of reality. And if we're actually saying, no, I deny my experience of reality because I know this hidden truth, that feels like a way of thinking that I want to leave behind, that I used to have. But it's terrifying, and so then we have to kind of grieve for the self that's going to die, and not just not think about it.
Because I think if you hang around church long enough, you start to think that really the only problem with death is that you don't get to see people for a while. We should kind of gloss over, exactly as you say, we should gloss over the whole death thing. It's obviously just a temporary thing, and it's really, really, really obviously heartbreakingly sad when people you love you can't see. However, it's only temporary, and sooner or later you'll see them again, and there we go. Yeah, it's fine.
And the Bible tells us this, but we don't like doing this. Like when Jesus talks to the Sadducees, right? This is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's the kind of debate that we talked about last time, that in Jesus' day, this was highly disputed, this whole resurrection of the dead. Like the Greek had an idea of the soul that could somehow live on as an idea, but the real resurrection of the dead. And then the Sadducees bring this strange case before Jesus about this woman who had married 7 people. All the brothers, they all keep dying, and you have this Levirate oath, or this Levirate marriage, where the next brother needs to take care of her and therefore marry her. And then the question is, who is she with when she gets to heaven? And Jesus has 2 answers. He knows it's about the resurrection. That's the second answer. And he says, well, you're mistaken, because our God is a God of the living. And then the first answer he gives, though, I'm just trying to find one of the passages so I don't read it wrong. I think Mark 12 is one of them. Yes, marriage and resurrection is even the title here. When the dead rise, they will neither marry or be given in marriage. They will be like angels in heaven. And so, that's one thing. Your spouse won't be your spouse. And for some people that may be yay. It's never a passage I've heard read at a wedding. It just doesn't chime with this idea of forever. But I mean, that's already a notion that where the Bible is very clear of a discontinuity. There's that relationship and that bodily identity. I mean, how much we draw on our gender is not going to be there, and that's not coming back.
So again, we have to live with multiple ideas in conflict, because we have to realize that a lot of this stuff talks about bodies, but we also have to deal properly with the fact that our earthly bodies will really die.
It will really rot, and then this celestial body goes through walls and eats fish nonetheless. Yeah.
And I think part of the problem is that we take some of the passages, I think they're probably in Paul, where he talks about death has not triumphed and death has been beaten. We take that to mean that human bodily death is not a big deal. But that's not actually what they're generally talking about. They're generally talking about the death in the sense that Adam and Eve died when they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
As a spiritual death is no longer an issue, but we take it in the wrong way.
And perhaps also that death, because you believe that this is all about a different yet somehow continuous kind of kingdom, then the death loses its scare. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's not that you get kind of restored, but it doesn't mean that then everything was for nothing.
Yeah, so I'm too busy grieving for the fact that I actually am going to die after I thought I wasn't. But now I have to somehow accept also that there is a genuine hope of something good. The resurrection is also a thing as well as death, but really being a thing. I'm not ready to do that. I don't know how to. I've got to do one thing at a time.
Yeah. But I mean, if we just think about the notion of physical death, again, coming back to it, like we on the one hand, we just emphasize the discontinuity aspect very strongly. And if you don't believe in resurrection, then that's even stronger because you say, well, that was it. But because of the way we work and we think, we experience life, we also know, like we said earlier, that doesn't mean that person is gone. The effects of that person on somebody's life can be very, very real, leading into therapy with traumatic effects, becoming an example and inspiration for many. So there is, even if we just take God out of the equation altogether, there is still that notion of continuity, which then informs your life. Because you say, well, there's still something remaining of me when I die. Now, I'm not saying that is everything the Christian faith is teaching, but I'm saying, even if you don't believe in any of this, you already have this problem that there is a continuity, because it's not satisfying for us then to say, well, if it's all just going away, I might as well just enjoy and forget everything. Like, we still aspire higher because we know there's something that remains.
Yeah, and the physical things you did and your body, the bits of your body continue as well. Like if you talk from a purely deterministic point of view, you have for the rest of time, the things that happened in your life continue to have a causal effect on the things in the future. Yeah,
absolutely. You can't be erased out of history.
But then, of course, there's the heat death of the universe, and it doesn't matter. Sorry, Leah, go on.
I was going to say, no, we're not talking about that. Going back to the justice theme, so there is then an argument that even if you don't believe in resurrection, that living a life that is dedicated to justice has an impact beyond what you do in the here and now, and has a wider impact on society.
If you don't look too far in the future and decide that it doesn't matter what impact it has.
But that's why Western individualism struggles, isn't it? Because if you live in any kind of society that has much more of a sense of the longevity of the community and the ancestors and the descendants, and they have a much stronger sense of handing on a legacy that's important to the next generation than we do, I think.
But of course, you still have the "what's it all about? What's the point of it?" question that emerges anywhere. I mean, thinking of the heat death of the universe kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
interestingly, Ecclesiastes in the Bible is the book that asks that question, and the real question is, like, why are my sons so useless? Like, and so you only ask the question of why is the universe so meaningless if you think that the effect you're having on the future is not a particularly good one.
yeah. And yet we can't. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, yet we can't stop asking that question, because I mean, even the preacher isn't quite happy with just it's all to nothing, and we're just chasing wind. There's something in us that doesn't let us go. And that connects us back to what we were talking last time, and also to our episode of about sin, that there is this aspiration that lives within us, that we think there is progress with it. Not progress necessarily just in this linear sense we bring it about, but we need to imagine a future being better than what we have now. So that is somehow really hardwired in us. And that's why I think this idea of resurrection is important to hold on to as a Christian, because it is an affirmation of being a part of that coming kingdom, that you're not just somehow laying groundwork and it all graduates in there and some other people get to inherit a beautiful earth or whatever when Jesus comes, but this is your future too. You're going toward that eternal kingdom of God. But it's a discontinuous one. It's not going to be you ending. I mean, the first thing perhaps to point a listener to is the Bible Project episode also on the question of whether heaven happens immediately after you die or Jesus comes back toward the end of the earth. And what they and their good biblical scholars end up saying is, no, it's actually the latter. It's all about this kingdom of God coming at the end and then people being resurrected into it.
Yeah, it is a good episode. It feels like, true to form, we seem much happier talking about death and the heat death of the universe than we do about resurrection.
Right.
I was just wondering about reading those verses in 1 Corinthians that we were talking about, with that idea of continuity and discontinuity in mind. Did you have them up still, Jörg?
Yeah. Oh, is this the one you mentioned with the with the house?
I've lost it in the notes.
That's 3, I think you said.
Yeah, 3. That's it.
Yeah. Should I read?
Yeah, please.
By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it, but each one should be careful how he builds, for one can lay any foundation other than the one for no one can lay any foundation. These little words matter, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Hey?
For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If it is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames.
So I find this hugely helpful when thinking about heaven and resurrection, because I really like that sense that Jesus is the foundation and we've chosen to build our lives on him. And actually, a lot of the time we're quite unaware of whether we're building with hay and straw that won't last, or whether we're building with gold, which will last, but that's what we're seeking to do. And it ties in for me with the way Jesus talks a lot in the Gospels about seeking to build up treasure in heaven, which isn't just something we're putting away for the future. It's part of our life now that will be shown in the future to either be worthwhile or not. But it's here now, and its worth will be shown in the future as part of the resurrection.
Mm-hmm. And I must confess, I didn't like that because I didn't understand the verse when we first discussed this. I felt that it's too vanilla, as it were. If you read it like on the face of it, Jesus is the foundation, so you've said the prayer of the repentant sinner, and now everything you do, you know, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. You sometimes build with straw, but hopefully you're better than that and you're building with stone. But as we talked about it, it really started appearing, well, if Jesus is the foundation, it's not that sinner's prayer, but we're actually investing in the spooky otherworldliness that appears in his resurrection. And that is so key to us talking about it, because then it also means our idea of heaven is not one of guarantee. It's one of letting go and letting ourselves fall, just how Jesus let himself fall into God's hands on the cross and say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And investing in that fall. So when you're building on this foundation of Jesus, you're setting your life, you're planning your values on that spooky future. So, I mean, that is so much more radical, and now I like it, because it's not the sort of program of, you know, be good and the rest will just get burned away and you're just building on your Sunday school foundation of having said yes to Jesus. But you're actually investing in this really weird reality. And in the Acts, in the book of Acts, just to finish that thought, this is exactly how they preach. They don't even begin talking about resurrection of the dead, of everybody, until like later in the book of Acts. They're just really so thrilled about this Jesus experience that they had, that's the reality they're totally invested in. And then only later do they begin asking the question, what does this mean for us? So it's about us investing in this really weird experience of there being this strange body that goes through walls and eats fish.
What I like about that is how it expresses our confusion and our inability to grasp things. It makes me wonder what we do about it. But Leah, something you said before we started recording was about Jesus being like the opposite of a utilitarian, and I wonder whether that investment in the spooky weird thing is linked to Jesus is not a utilitarian.
Well, because I think as Christians we're in as much danger as anyone else of thinking, well, we've got to achieve these good ends. You know, we've got to. We said we wouldn't go here, but we've got to get the right president elected because that will achieve certain ends. And
well, you didn't say who the right president should be.
Right?
So it's bipartisan.
So I've left it that wide open. Because these are the ends we've got to achieve, and Jesus just cuts through all of that. Everything about Jesus is so holistic, and so the end is always embodied in the means. It's always all part of the same thing. You don't get to a good end by violence unless that violence is something that you allow yourself to suffer. That's I can't quite explain it, but I just feel it's totally central to who Jesus was, that you can never justify anything that's slightly not good in order to achieve good.
But he also modelled like being randomly, I mean, maybe it wasn't random, but it seems random who he was talking to and healing, but he was like completely present with that random person. And potentially that's another aspect of like acting without judging all the consequences, right? It's just like, this person is here, even if I only got here today because I was being really selfish. And I'm not building on that naive foundation that Jörg was mentioning of like being a good person. I'm still here. This person is here, and it's random, and I can be completely present with that person, maybe at that moment.
Yeah. And it's almost an investment in discontinuity, because you're saying, well, I'm going to die, so why would I hold on to this? And this is how we often don't think, right? So we're like, I'm going to die, I might as well make this money your problem, dear beggar. Like, it's not, I'm not invested in this anymore. I'm going to let go of that element because I'm falling into a different future. I'm falling into God's future. And that God's future tells me about a world where people live in harmony, where they like you said, Leah, they don't try and achieve something just to their own ends, but they're actually looking to understand, trying not to. So all of that, if I'm investing in this is a massive investment in discontinuity and letting go of aspirations.
And it's letting go of that whole sense of efficiency and measurable outcomes, and we so want to do good in very specific ways that have very specific impacts.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of development program.
Yeah. It can be, we've talked about this previously about generosity. It can be extravagant and poorly targeted and
be really valuable in this other value system.
And it goes against a lot of our ways of thinking about efficiency and the ends justifying the means.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
Isn't it really dangerous? Like you talk about investing in this other reality. Like, isn't that what we sometimes criticize of? Like, basically believing this fantasy world and then making decisions on the basis of it.
Yeah, it is, and it has to be because we don't know. Obviously, I'm not just not being reckless for recklessness' sake, but taking serious the reality of death really changes your value system.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think about what is it that I'd like to be remembered for. And again, I'm sounding extremely worldly and unchristian when I say that, but what I'm trying to get to is that sometimes the idea, this sort of continuous idea of resurrection, prevents us from asking these harsh questions because we don't think of heaven as this very different godly reality. And what we should be doing is we should be more invested in the notion of death and then say we preach a kingdom of God that comes at the end of time. So if that's the reality, if that's the continuity I want to invest in, I should do it. And then this vision of this otherworldly kingdom that comes toward us, that will be worldly, should guide what we do. So it's not an anything goes and kind of do whatever you want, but there is a specific Christian idea of what we're investing into, but it's a radical discontinuity, and it means letting go of a lot of notions that I have, how I can grow into this world or how I'm still going to be the same. I'm actually allowing that world to blow me apart.
And I find this in a very real sense in my job, because I could argue that what I do for work has a really high purpose and is meant to be achieving something. Do I give all my time and effort to that, or do I spend more time in prayer and other things, investing in time with friends, time with people around me who might need it? Or do I... There's a one sort of spiritual way of thinking that might say, well, no, you've got a really clear mandate in what your work is, achieve something in that, build something, create a legacy. But I don't fully know if that's hay and straw or gold.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, but that's exactly what those are exactly choices that come to light then, don't they? That sometimes we think something is a higher moral purpose, but if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, would screwing a new solar panel on somebody's roof be really the last thing you want to do? And I mean, or is there reconciliation that needs to happen with somebody?
Yeah.
Or is there, or is there that last sermon to preach? Or is there something else that you think, wait a minute, my investment isn't just that? So those are the questions that really come to light when we begin to think about resurrection as not just a continuation of the perfect life.
I think I think it's really interesting that when we're making really practical decisions, like, how many of the hours of my life go into my work, if my work is a good thing. Like, I feel like we're getting to some kind of exciting idea of how you make those decisions, which is like a combination of, it's probably a combination of loads of things, but the three things that have been coming to my mind in this conversation have been a combination of, like, believing in this sort of wild idea that that there's like this magical, spooky resurrection, and also believing fully in our own death, and also looking from the perspective of maybe there is no God, or and none of this is real, because not necessarily because we want to take that position, but because it helps us make decisions about what has value, without going too far down the line of doing something that's really bad because of some abstract idea that we've taken on board. This is the thing I've talked about before of, like, it had better be worthwhile if I'm going to invest in this thing. So there's like these three completely contrary viewpoints that maybe can lead us to make good decisions day to day.
Yeah, it's strange. Together they seem to sometimes point in a similar direction. That's really...
And it's a million miles away from the feeling I had for a lot of my Christian life, was that the most important thing I could do was make sure other people became Christians.
And hang on to these ideas unmodified.
Yeah,
and
go get copied into the computer in the sky. But then actually the mandate is to make other people aware of the reality of death, stop avoiding that conversation, and then tacking on top of that conversation, what is that future that's coming toward you when you're dead? What is it that we're investing in? What is the foundation? And that's exactly where the church begins. They have this really, really weird experience of Jesus as the first fruit coming back from the dead and having this strange ghost-like existence, but still being fully present. And then they begin to invest in that. That's really weird, isn't it? But that's what we call to preach.
Some of those in workforces.
Something else that's happened to me is that I used to have kind of two worldviews that I interchanged for different purposes. So I used to work in science, and I had a completely deterministic worldview that I used to, design experiments and think about things. And then I had this other worldview which was had some kind of magical God stuff in it, which I used for some of the rest of my life. And I felt more comfortable in the deterministic viewpoint, even though I found it appalling when I kind of thought about it and hoped that it wasn't true. But when at some point I kind of gave up on the magical thing and thought, well, it can't be like that. I don't know what it's like. And then and after that, I kind of feel like I've started to believe in some kind of magical life force. Like when I read Richard Rohr, I've mentioned him again. When I read Richard Rohr and he says there's a pattern in the universe of death and new life, like seeds grow and plants grow from the bodies of animals or whatever. I'm like, yeah, there is this pattern of life and death. Like life does come out of death, and so resurrection is a pattern that we see in the world. There is a sort of magic after all.
But I guess if listener listens to this, so are we then actually now erasing the notion of resurrection? Have we said, well, really, it's more like, you get reabsorbed by the earth, and then a worm eats your flesh, and that will feed a rose, and beautiful flowers grow, and then a bird will sit there, and
is it just a lovely metaphor for the awful reality?
For the awful reality, and the continuity is really just the molecules and not the meaning of them.
Yeah, I just can't deal with that right now. That's too bleak.
I think what I was describing,
Yeah.
what I was describing was not that, right? Right.
Yeah.
What I was describing was when I read someone like Richard Rohr saying something like that, which I would have really scorned at some point in my life, and gone, "Oh yeah, that's a nice metaphor that lets you like not believe anything but pretend that you still do." And now when I read it, I think, yeah, that's a pattern that I actually see.
Yeah.
Like that's like seeing God, the evidence for God in the world. In some,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a metaphor. It's definitely a metaphor, not what actually happens to us when we die. I'm sorry.
But what I'm saying is, I feel like it's a pattern that therefore demonstrates,
Yes.
allows me to believe
No, I'm
there is
totally
this
with you,
yeah.
but Jörg's taken it on to
Yeah.
another place of his own dark imagination.
No.
Which-
Actually, I asked this because I don't. I asked this because I don't want to land there, because that's a world without hope. Well, it's a world without a human hope. It's a world
It's
that
like
kind of it just says, well, creation is good. God made the universe the way it is. I mean, you can keep God in the picture on that side of things, but there's no future. It just goes. It's just a cycle. It's beautiful in itself. It's like an aesthetic kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
it's a consolation.
yeah, and in some of my, as Leah would call them, darker moments, I have to admit, I'm happy with that. I can sink back into the earth and say, great. But then I look around at the suffering in the world, and I look around what else is going on, and I ask for meaning, and I want something more. And that brings me back to the idea of the kingdom. That says I need something coming toward me, and then the best understanding of that is, no, I will be part of this God's future, not just as a bird feather somewhere, but there's still an element of continuity, that what I'm doing here now, what I am now, is part of that God's coming future. So hard to talk about these things and keep them apart. But that's, I think, why I don't want to get stuck there. I mean, that was part of our conversation with the other Andy, that I said, well, why don't we just give up? But then there is still something within us that drives us to a different kind of world, to a different vision. If we didn't have that, I think we could just pack it in and say, yeah, it's beautiful the way it is. Enjoy your 70 plus years if you get that, and fall back into the earth. And that's fine. I actually have nothing against this. I would still be a happy person if that was the case. And I would still be a Christian, by the way, if that was the case.
But it's much more fine for you and me in our relatively comfortable Western happy families than it is for a lot of people.
Yes, although I must also say that, I mean, the thing that always fascinates me when I meet people in Africa is how happiness doesn't disappear with things. That's the thing we can never remember. Like, life is dreadful and hard, and there are huge challenges. There's a huge pressure on mental health service and so on. But it's not like you get the sense that 80% of people aren't happy, whereas here it's only 20%. Like, that's not how it works. There is a sense in which there is a hope that lives in all humans that can always imagine a better tomorrow.
Yeah, but some people's lives are just daily misery.
Yes.
And it would be a very hard pill for someone in that situation to swallow, to say this is all it is and then it's over.
Yeah, I just don't want people in that situation to become our alibi for holding on to heaven.
No.
That's why I'm kind of pushing toward the counterweight and say, actually, humans seem to settle in misery because they have that hope in them. Not settle in misery, but like be able to endure misery because they have that hope in them that tomorrow it's going to be different. Anyway, that was a rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole. Definitely
So
a rabbit hole.
That like for me personally, I have to get over the that whole this is a consolation that lets you pretend that you still believe in something when you've stopped believing in anything. If I get over that and take that stuff, like, you know, the pattern of life and death in the world, and let it inspire me, then it's a really exciting idea. The idea that we're all made out of stars and the continuity that exists there. It's actually really exciting and can help me appreciate, the sort of magical life force stuff that I'm also excited about. Like it makes it easier for me to understand that, but only if I put aside that thing of, oh yeah, this is a great metaphor that consoles me about how there's nothing.
Yeah, and I think it leaves a slightly more vacuous moral element, because other than evolution, and I don't know why we think evolution and progress or higher complexity is of higher value, but that's the only value that lives in that kind of a system, isn't it?
Mm.
So then you can very well imagine a world where just the strongest survive, and you might accelerate their process even. Well, I mean, that's Nietzsche plus then going into Nazis. So if you just have that, I mean, if we don't have a future but a constant evolution without something breaking in from the future that comes toward us, I don't know. Like it leaves me. Yeah, some days I'm with that and I'm fine with it, and other days I think actually that just there's nothing in there that will then drive any ethical reflection.
It actually does remind me, the resurrection as a metaphor thing reminds me, and like being okay with that reminds me of what Richard Dawkins talks about in his kind of excitement about, I get to be part of this evolutionary story. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's actually the complexity that he mentions as, it's totally wonderful that I am a tiny piece of this story, and that's his consolation, and it's very similar to Go on, Leah.
Well, I get to sound like the real Christian here, don't I? But I want to meet Jesus in some shape or form, whatever that looks like. He still absolutely amazes and fascinates me as I read the Gospels, and I want to. That thing about we only see in a mirror darkly right now, and we'll see face to face. That excites me.
Yeah. I have zero concept of that.
Well, Mark Twain would say it's not possible because it's too crowded.
Too many people.
Around Jesus.
I'll be content with a footstep. That'll be fine. I'll build a shrine and I'll carry on.
Build a shrine over it. Okay.
Well, it's a lot of time, right? So you could just join the queue.
Yeah, that's the thing that Mark Twain doesn't wrap us around.
Yeah.
But I was just going to... I think we're having the same continuity and discontinuity conversation, aren't we? So, like, Dawkins' vision is one of fundamental continuity, and I think there's a beauty in it, and we have to hold these two things in balance. This is true. But there's an aspect of discontinuity because it does end at some point, this beautiful evolutionary process, if you want to stay in Dawkins' world. We die if you want to stay in our individual world. And we hope for a future that is not simply a slightly improved presence, but a really different kind of breaking in of God's Spirit. So for a Christian vision of resurrection, it's holding those two things together. It's investing in a certain discontinuity. I mean, the whole thing is that's absurd, investing in a discontinuity. How do you invest in something that comes... It's different, but that's the idea. That's the idea of a Christian resurrection, that what I do now matters, but it doesn't... like we talked about heaven, it doesn't bring that thing in. It's not everything, but I need to let myself go and say, God, I've done this. I've laid these stones and maybe some straw on this foundation, and now I'm awaiting what comes.
And the continuity is Jesus, right? So that's the foundation. That's going to be there.
But he had to go through the same thing.
Yeah, totally.
He had to go through the same thing. I mean, that's the interesting bit, right? And when God came, I mean, that's the story of Christian. He had to say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Yeah,
so that's like bridging past the discontinuity. Yeah, I think Jesus was what came to mind as the looking at Jesus' behaviour is what debunks the whole consolation of, well, at least a flower will grow out of my body after I've died. Yeah, right, that's so the opposite of what Jesus was doing.
Well, that's why the resurrection is that scandal that you will always run into. Like, that's the one that never squares away, and it hasn't for 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm. But I think what you were saying there is that, like, we, through seeing the resurrected Jesus, there's a continuity, there's a thing like a bridge or something toward to that second thing, that thing that comes after.
Mm-hmm. And the life that we see of Jesus is the hint of what's to come, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those things that he went about doing, the character that he showed us, in some way which I do not understand, will be revealed more fully in heaven, in the resurrected life, if we're not going to call it heaven.
I was just thinking, I mean...
We're not going to call it heaven, we better start again.
Well, that's what we said last episode, wasn't it? Heaven was the place where God's rule held sway, and it's not necessarily, the Bible doesn't talk about heaven as the place we go when we die. Yeah.
It's the place that comes down to earth at the end of time.
Yeah.
And then we get to be part of that. And that's the big difference to Dawkins, that there is this idea that it's not heat death of the universe, but there is an end to it that is more full and complete. Wow, that was a meta conversation. So what happens to me when I die?
I'm not sure we helped anyone with that question.
Well, maybe we did a bit. Like we said, you don't just come back again the same. You know, death is real, and we know that death is real. If we're honest about our experience of life, we can tell that death is real. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes we can also tell that death is not the whole story. And we have some clues about what the story might be a bit like.
And I think for me, the thing, once you start to think about this, it changes how you want to behave in today. And I mean, if anything, the whole question, what happens to me after I die, is an academic one, because ultimately we don't know. We're working off of belief. And why are we even having this conversation? Because it informs how we live today. So thinking about this aspect of continuity and discontinuity actually has an effect of what I want to do, like we were talking about earlier. Like, what does this then mean about my choices that are before me? Am I really thinking about this? Am I thinking the time I've missed with my kids, I'll get back in heaven? No, you won't. So it does inform our choices.
Does that link with what we were saying about, because we said we were going to talk about the story of Lazarus. Is it Abraham and Lazarus?
Well, the rich man and Lazarus is the story, but Lazarus gets to sleep in Abraham's bosom.
Right. And so what we were saying about that before we started recording is that the point of that parable is to talk about how you behave now, as opposed to teach you theology about what happens after you die. Yeah. But what do we learn about how we behave now from that parable?
That you don't need to know what it's like after heaven. Actually, yeah, that is the point. You don't need to know what it's like after you die, what it's like in heaven, because it already has everything in the scripture how you should live. So you don't have to solve that riddle of heaven, because that's how it ends.
Right.
Because the rich man begs. I mean, the story is, I might as well just read it. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple, fine linen, lived in luxury every day. At his gate was a beggar named Lazarus, covered in sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died. The angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. Interesting, right? Language. One falls into the ground and the other one gets carried up. In hell, where he was in torment, and I think the hell I don't have time to check this, but it strikes me as a little strange translation. Where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." We'll have to unpack this next episode, I think, when we talk about the wicked and what happens to them. But anyway, He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And I mean, the whole point of the story is but the story is saying in the face of it, you do not need to know what it's like after you die to make the right choices in the now. And what have we taken the story to mean? Here's what it's like in the afterlife, so better make the right choices now.
Because otherwise you get stuck on the wrong side of the chasm.
Yeah, exactly. But what the story actually is trying to say, it's already there. You don't need to know.
Oh, that's so hard for me to listen to and not just do the other thing. I'm so put off by trying to learn theology from it that I can't listen to what it's actually saying.
But if you read it as a parable, right? If you read it as a parable, not as a realistic description, but as a parable, I'm working with what you understand about life after death. So this rich man goes into this Sheol-like place. That's why I don't like the translation hell, but I have to look that up, whether I'm just making this up or whether there is something more depth into it.
When you say Sheol, you're talking about the view at the time of where people went when they died.
The land of the dead, and so they're just kind of in this kind of strange state of slumber. I guess it's not quite the same because he sits in this fire and he's in clear agony, but something happens to him.
But by calling it hell, we've further reinforced, in that translation, calling it hell, we further reinforced this idea that it's telling us something about heaven and hell. Yeah.
Exactly. And it doesn't play with the story anyway, because there was no proper judgment. The only thing the guy did wrong was that he had more than the other guy.
Yeah.
Like, he's not even being judged for not giving anything. It's just like, you had it good, now the other guy has it better. And the only judgment is you should have known that this wasn't okay. I guess there is some judgment. Take that back.
And they can talk to each other.
And they can talk to each other strangely across that.
So we don't take that as our theology, right? We just take the other bit. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. We don't talk about the phone line to hell. In the Good Place they had that. I mean, they have this communication.
I'm sure the liturgists did a whole episode about Abraham's bosom as a result of talking about this parable.
Probably, yeah.
It's a song, actually.
Yeah,
it's really
that was
good.
a song. I think that was it. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so that's at the heart of what we're sometimes struggling with on all this stuff. I think that
we want a realistic picture in order to make sense, and actually what we need to do is think about the philosophy behind it, or think about how we don't know, and let ourselves fall in that discontinuity to receive from Jesus the faith in this new kingdom.
And then the question of how does that affect my behaviour? Like the same, similar to sheep and the goats. It's like, it's not even hard to. If that's what you're actually focusing on, then it's pretty easy to see. Like, look after the poor, look after people in prison, like make court systems be fair.
Or simply care.
That's not the hard bit.
Begin caring too. I mean, the thing that bothers me today and for these past 2 days is there's a civil war starting in Ethiopia, and there's nobody talking about it because we're all focused on somebody, the unnameable.
We're going to start a Voldemort thing, are we? He shall not be named.
The one who shall not be named. It's just like it's just a matter of caring too. And how often do we do this? Not just with big countries, but people in front of us, because we're invested in a story of continuity. I need to live my life now, and it'll continue like this, and you'll get your reward. But if we're invested in Jesus' kingdom, and the fact that we're going to fall into a very discontinuous kind of state of existence, we would think differently about these encounters with poor people or something.
And it's that kingdom. It's that kingdom legacy, isn't it? I've been thinking about the Richard Dawkins kind of being a contributor to building this evolutionary story, and that's on the one hand, and then I feel like on the other hand is this Christian message that we're not building evolutionary progress, we're building a kingdom of God, and all the other things we've talked about in other episodes about what that actually means. And if we can see our lives as an investment in building that,
and how short our lives are too, in light of this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the building time we get.
Yeah.
Then next thing we know is we're going to wake up in this kingdom.
And going back to those 1 Corinthians verses, is our particular building in this kingdom of God going to consist of anything? Is it?
Yeah, or just the foundation.
Is it just going to be the foundation?
It's good that you've brought it back to your sense of guilt and hopelessness. Yeah.
Well, I was sounding really kind of religious earlier, so to bring it back down to earth.
So I feel like there's a whole other podcast about how our attitudes on this affect how we think about other people, because we've only really talked about how we think about ourselves, and then Jörg, you just mentioned, the idea that other people will get what they deserve, so we don't have to worry too much, and that so we probably shouldn't go on to that. So you should probably be stopping now. But yeah, there's more to this. Maybe.
No, you're right. You're right. Yes. Yeah.
So if I had to summarise, I think we talked about how death is real, and it's not just erased. Being defeated is not the same as being erased. And we've talked about how there's both continuity and discontinuity that we can observe in the world, but also that we have this story of both continuity and discontinuity in what people saw in Jesus, and in Jesus' behaviour and investing in a way that's not logical or that it's not utilitarian, doesn't fit hitting targets or most effective political action. But the thing that's been most important to me is the idea that even though we have no clue what it is, we do have a story that has hope, that there's meaning, and that we, in some sense, we will be there in some future.
Or perhaps phrase it more with more faith in it. We choose to invest into that story because we trust people who have seen somebody risen from the dead. I mean, this is why resurrection is so central to Christianity. And we say, well, if this is what happened with Jesus, if there is this sort of, if what he said cannot be killed, then I want a part of that.
That's better, because that's a type of faith. So if listener is listening and thinking, well, some days I don't have that hope at all, listener can still choose to act with that, in that faithful way, investing in that thing, even on those days. Cool. We've got a Bible reading that we're going to have you agreed to finish.
Right, and this is 1 Corinthians again, but out of that huge section about the resurrection of the dead. I'm reading 1 Corinthians 15, verse 35 and following. But someone may ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body.
It's a lot of accepting mystery in that.
And accepting that what we do is some kind of investment, but it's not the same. We're not going to see the same kind of thing. Yeah, it's an investment in discontinuity.
Yeah. I feel like, genuinely, well, it's a bit cheesy, but I feel like we've invested in this conversation in stuff that will grow later. Like, I don't feel like we've...
Hopefully. It certainly died in some places.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think these ideas are going to continue, not just next episode when we talk about, who gets in, but also in future episodes.
Nice.
Cool. Thank you very much, Leah. Thank you, Jörg. And see you next time.
Cool, cheers, bye.
Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.